Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast Normalize This Sh. I'm your host, Dr. Matthew Moffitt, and today I'm here with Philip Zhunior, who is a community engagement manager at Ubisoft. He spent 10 years working in various roles across marketing and PR, mostly in the tech industry and gaming, and he's also my very good friend. Today we're going to be talking about burnout and pandemic fatigue. Philip, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Hey Matt, thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty good. I'm very hyped to record this with you.
Well, thanks for coming on. First question, can you tell me a little bit about what community engagement manager does at Ubisoft? Like, what is your role?
Yeah, sure. So I work a lot with social media and just in general comms. So we work on providing different strategy for our titles on like how do we communicate with our community, how do we engage with them, what channels do we use, and then we build up a calendar of like what pulse points are important for each game. It's basically a lot of scheduling work, a lot of creative work in terms of writing copies, messages, blog posts, social posts, all of that stuff. And a big part of that is also like understanding the feedback that's coming from the community to the company and trying to dissect like what actions we can take from that.
So you're wearing many hats.
Exactly, yes. That's how I like to put it.
Sometimes when I talk to you, you say, I can't talk. I've got to go to a meeting. How many meetings? Are you always in meetings? Are you emails? And
I mean, that depends. I'm always in emails for sure. In terms of meetings, like each week is pretty unique. Probably most of the time, like Monday through Wednesday, I'm like in meetings all day long with maybe like a couple of hours just for free work. And then like Fridays are probably the days when I'm having most time to actually like sit down and do some work.
like actual implementation of whatever you're doing, like whatever you've
Exactly.
discussed.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, can I ask you why you chose burnout and pandemic fatigue? What I think it's a pretty appropriate topic, but from your personal perspective.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I've experienced burnout myself. I've seen other people experience it. I think it's finally becoming an important topic of conversation just in general in the world, right? In social media and the press. And it's finally getting some visibility, but I still think it's important to talk about it more and to maybe hopefully give people some tools on how to recognize it, how to deal with it, stuff like that. In my own, like when I was just starting my career, this wasn't really a part of a conversation, and I didn't have any idea of what it is before I experienced it. So hopefully
Yeah.
this episode could help some people like deal with this.
Beautiful. I love the way you put that. And I think you know, I like to think we're both around the same age.
Around the same, yeah.
I think we started our careers like, you think video games and tech industry and gaming, therapy, the irony of therapy and doing therapy is that this is also not a very well researched, well, it's real research, but it's not well talked about and normalized for people. I think from the therapy side, we go in to help people, and a lot of the early research started in the healthcare profession, noticing what people went through. But it's really expanded to everywhere you look, and um, you're absolutely right. Like science and the is coming together with media to finally make this a thing we should care about. As you were talking, I was like, because one of the big debates in burnout is burnout versus depression. How do we diagnose it? Is it something that can be included in as a disability? And that's still a widely debated topic, but uh, it's serious, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. So, this is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I think it's an important topic.
All right. So, when you were early in your career, or you said you've been through it before, what for you was Burnout. I mean, I think everyone would have an individual experience, but what for you was the hallmark of burnout?
I think the first time that I understood what it is and I understood I had burnout was the point where I remember it was almost like I think 9 years ago, but around this month of April, I just woke up. I had breakfast. I was on my way to work, and I was thinking to myself, like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like,
Mm,
I just there was no specific reason that I could think of. It wasn't a particularly challenging day. I didn't have like an important meeting or a presentation that day. It was just a normal day of the week, and I just had trouble motivating myself to actually come in and do the work. And then I dug deeper into it. And like throughout the week, I was trying to understand what I was feeling, how to deal with this. I've noticed that I'm like less productive. I wasn't feeling the same, even though there were no like obvious factors to why it would happen. I just wasn't feeling the same, and I was impatient. I was, cranky all the time, and
mm.
I wasn't just happy to do the work. I think that's when I first like noticed what it was, and I started googling and reading and trying to understand. Okay, like how do I get out of this?
Well, it's really there's added, I would say, distress, and a lot of researchers talk about guilt too, because we don't go into like I didn't go into therapy to be burnt out and wake up one day and go, I don't want to do this anymore. It's not like, we we generally enjoy what we do. I love helping people. You love being wearing these many hats and implementing amazing things at Ubisoft. But then, I look at this quote. I found this quote from Richard Gunderman, and he says he described the incremental onset of burnout as, quote, the accumulation of hundreds or thousands of tiny disappointments, each one hardly noticeable on its own. But it really is a straw breaks the camel's back scenario. Um, you know, I think I remember doing like when I was in graduate school, uh, looking at police officer data on what is the thing that causes them to be burnt out. And you would probably think like, oh, like a traumatic incident or dealing with a really heavy violent situation. Um, and no, it's paperwork. And it's the same thing for me. It's like paperwork. It's the things that take away from the thing that I'm trying to do, right? Which
That's
is,
a that's a
yeah,
great way to put it. Yeah, I
go
I
ahead.
think for me it's when it's even when it's something boring or like monotonous, it's just as long as the activity needs your constant energy to stay focused, I think that's when it accumulates more and more into something that just causes you to like, run out of fuel.
Yeah. And to be clear for our listeners, at least in the current literature, burnout is strictly related to job related stress. They define it as a psychological syndrome emerging as a prolonged response to chronic interpersonal stressors on the job. A lot of research has explored the relationship between burnout and depression, and that's still ongoing. But to delineate of like, there's like three key dimensions: overwhelming exhaustion, as Philip mentioned, feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job, and then a lack of accomplishment and a sense of ineffectiveness. And as I say them out loud, I think to myself, I felt that all three of them like so many times.
Same, I'm the same.
I mean, what is that like for you? I mean, you and I, we talk about video games all the time. We love video games for a number of different reasons. I mean, for me, it's I grew up with them. I'm sure you grew up with them, but like the stories. What is that to be in a profession that you went in and you do for love, but in the middle of it is like you said, you wake up and you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. What is that like kind of dissonance for you, like this paradox?
Yeah, I think when people like think of, working in games and video games, they think it's just dudes sitting all day on a couch playing games, eating pizzas, and like drinking beers at the end of the day, right? Like that's the dream illusion, I think. The real version is that unfortunately it's still a lot of hard work. There's still a lot of, even in a creative, if you're a creative role, like still you need to do paperwork, you need to have meetings, you need to write up reports, and there's not always like this dreamlike magical feeling of doing something amazing. Like people fight, teams disagree. There's obviously still money involved. It's still a business. So companies need to earn money. They need to think about expenses and budgets and following budgets and scheduling. So while the end product is great, it's creative, it's inspiring, the process of creating that product, it's still monotonous and it's still a lot of hard work. Just the same as like building a car or like putting a chair together. It's the same with a video game. It's still hard work at the end of the day. So for me, I understood it when I just came in, of course.
Mhm.
I think I didn't have that many illusions, thankfully. But it was still somewhat of a surprise to me of how much that world is still a business. It's way less creative than people would expect. It's still very much a business.
Hmm. What is your what are your usual hours? Because I know there's times when you're crunching and like if you're doing an esports event, like you were working like crazy, but are you doing 10-hour days usually? Are you doing 12? Are you yeah.
So normally I try to do 9 to 8 hour days, and quite a lot of times I'm successful at that.
Hmm.
And then about, I'd say, once every quarter, there are a few crunch weeks when I have to do 10, 12-hour days. A few times per year, we have probably around 2 weeks of extra crunch when we can do anywhere between 12 and 18 hours per day. And that
Oh,
depends on the
goodness. Yeah.
person. But
Do you enjoy
generally,
those?
that's. Hmm?
Do you enjoy those though?
Sometimes, to be honest, it's not like we're mandated to crunch. Like, hey, like you have to stay on this, or like you're fired. No, like generally we're discouraged by managers to actually do that. We're told to take time off, take
Yeah.
vacation days. Like the company, to its credit, does a lot to make us avoid crunch. But when you're trying to make something great, when you're trying to invest all of the skill, all of the passion that you have in a project, you're not gonna, in my personal opinion, maybe that's just the case for me, but in my personal opinion, you're not gonna achieve something great unless you put the extra effort in.
Hmm.
So crunch it's mostly self-mandated. It's not like it's forced, but so we in some cases we generally enjoy it. We enjoy the process of trying to extract the most skill and effort out of yourself. It's just that the aftermath of that is unfortunately not always great. But there are definitely strategies and ways to dealing
Yeah.
with that and getting the extra rest.
I wonder what tips the scales for you. Like, because I'm the same way with, I've been, you and I know personally, I've been writing for about a decade now. So, like, I'll work during the day. My son will go down at night. And then around from like 8:30 to 9, I'll write till about midnight or 1. And then I'll play some video games. And my usual when I'm feeling good is, you know, in bed at 1, 1:30, maybe 2, and then up at like 7, 7:30, taking my son to school or whatever. And most of the time, I'm not feeling burnt out, right? Like, even though that's a long thing to do, I love writing. I love doing my therapy. I started another project, this podcast, right? Like, I'm constantly moving. Um, and I wonder, like, and I'm thinking in my own life, what tips the scales in the direction of when I feel like I'm doing something great and I'm pushing towards something really good, and then it goes from nothing is great and this is ridiculous and I'm so tired of it. And I have those moments as well in the midst of those processes. And I'd like your opinion on that. I don't know that answer. I'm just asking like what it is for you.
Um, I think, well, my case is probably pretty unique, but I think for every single person, right, it is unique.
I think so.
In my situation, usually what tips the scale is lack of control. Like when, um, well, when you work on big projects, there are a lot of things that you cannot control. That your work alone, while an important like factor, like it still doesn't decide everything, right? There's a lot of factors, like even with COVID, for example, a lot of things just are out of our control. So no matter the effort that you put into the project, like personal or work project, like sometimes the result or even the process of coming to that result is not what you'd expect, no matter the effort you put in. And I think when you see that, like, hey, I did everything I absolutely could, I put in 200%, but it's still not what you want it to be. And because of factors that are outside of your control, I think that's when it hits you like mentally. Like, like what's the point of doing this? Like if I still cannot achieve something, if I still cannot achieve what I'm trying to do. I think that's, for me personally, that's the biggest cause of feeling dejected.
Well, the irony of that is you think your situation is pretty unique, but I actually would say the same. I find myself most discouraged when I get a really negative review or a producer says to me, "Hey, this isn't going to work." A literary agent that doesn't take my work, and then I feel like I'm back at square one. I spent the last 7 months writing this novel, and for the most part, I've been fine with it. But when I go to submit, that'll be the time like, oh, all this hard work has it been, for naught. I think in my day to day life, it's like with patience, it's that kind of the grueling. With therapy, there's no guarantee, right? I could see somebody for 6 months and we can make great strides, and then for some reason, they switch insurances or they have to move to a different state because there's regulations on who you can see. You have to see within your state. Uh, and then all of a sudden, you can't really check up on them. But if they come back to you in a year and things are worse, and it's like I just feel bad. Like if you kind of internalize and go, man, like obviously it's not my fault, but I think as any therapist or any person in a health service field, there's a little bit of like, you care about them, you want them to succeed, and there's no guarantee on that. And it's just like trying to stay present of in the moment of the work I'm doing right now in this 60-minute session with this individual. That's where I can make change for them. I think that's what, at least that's what I've learned with my writing too, is like, okay, I can't control what ends up happening with this thing. But if I'm able to just be present and enjoying what I'm doing, enjoying the story I'm crafting, then can I find some fulfillment in that? Because
Yeah,
I can't really control the.
yeah. You have to find joy in the small things.
Mhm. Yeah.
That definitely helps.
How has it? I mean, you mentioned pandemic. How has for you? How has your work changed in the pandemic? Have you, dare I say, been more susceptible to burnout? Um, I mean, I could talk ad nauseum about the switch to go working from home for me.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I'm the same way.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
I think the biggest surprise of the change is that burnout and just fatigue, they started to come from unexpected places. When you look at, I mean, personally, when I look at work from home, I love it. Just generally
Mhm.
as a, as a human being, I love it. I don't have to spend time commuting. I'm in the comfort of my own home. I can make my own lunch. When I'm done with work, I'm free. I can go out with friends. I can go watch a movie. I don't need to spend any extra time, right, on getting ready or whatever. So while on paper it's awesome, I think the things that you don't necessarily think about, but you lose them, is like, for example, a lack of social support.
Mhm.
When you're in the office in a team environment, and you have that kind of social relief, right? You have people around you, they're doing the same thing, they're in the same boat as you kind of support each other. And it's not something that's, I think, spoken of as often as it needs to be, but really, like, your team, they're your number one support in a work environment. And while remote teams are a thing, of course, and we will all stay in touch. Thankfully, we have great tools to connect, have meetings, have video chats. It's just not the same as having a human being sitting next to you, and just having some banter
Yes.
to relax during the day. And then that all of the tools that we use to connect, they became a problem like of its own, right? You've heard of the term Zoom fatigue. Like,
Mhm.
all of those meetings in front of a camera, and like, it all just adds up. It's, for whatever reason, I'm not smart enough to figure it out, but for whatever reason, it's not the same as like being in the same room. It feels different, and it feels weird just staring at your own face for a whole day. And I don't know, it's just it's just
No.
weird. You're weirdly uh more self-aware of like how do
Mhm.
you look, what are your facial expressions. You try to control them more. You either try to look more serious if it's a serious meeting, or whatever, but you put kind of more effort into a meeting when a camera is on your face and you can see yourself. So that's one thing. And one of the other things that had an unexpected effect for me was, while I love not having to commute, also just staying at home became a chore.
Oh
You
yeah.
don't have the disconnect between work and home environment. And I remember distinctly that, like, about 2 months into work from home, I was done with all of my work stuff. I was planning to play some video games. I sit down on my couch, and I just, like, I didn't know what to do. I just felt heavy, and I felt uninterested. I was like, well, I'm so tired. Like, I didn't really step outside for the whole day, and I don't want to stay at home and do anything. I just want to get out, and I needed to go out and get some fresh air. So I think work from home, it can help in a lot of ways if you manage it properly, but also, like, you can get trapped into some things that you don't expect.
Mhm. I'm so glad you mentioned that because, when I shifted from seeing patients in person to doing televideo, it's like this is my office here. In our little office space, right? And I don't know. I think everyone's different, and this is, for listeners, this is a broad generalization. But I think men are more distinctly like black or white in, like, I want this space here for this, and I want that space here for that, and to keep them separate. Because I mean, my only reference for that is my wife is totally fine doing televideo, but I'm like, like it's that old episode of Seinfeld where like my worlds emerge, like they've collided, and it's like my work life has now become my home life. The space that I occupy for video games and reading and joking with my wife and watching TV has now become a space filled with client stress and managing the business. And there's no delegation anymore. And so now you kind of have this like merging of things. And that really has gotten to me. Uh, for other people, like my wife, she could do this indefinitely. But in terms of therapy, I miss seeing people in person. I miss having colleagues, and I finally got back into the office. I'd say 2 months ago, and my patients are like, "This is so weird seeing you for the first time." Some of my patients we've worked for a year and haven't seen each other in person. And I'm like, "Yeah, I can't. I can only see your face. I can't read your body expression. Like I don't know everything about trying to be in the room with you, what that feels like." I think that goes with social support too. Being around
Yeah,
other
you
people.
need the personal connection. Exactly.
You do. You really do. It's been an adjustment. I was, just to kind of like, I was, before our talk, I was trying to research some of this, and they talk about new variants of burnout related to pandemic fatigue. And I wanted to ask you, due to these, because for me, I feel this way, so that's why I'm asking. Given everything that's happened, like in the world with COVID, but I mean, other stuff's going on right now internationally. One of these things is like feeling less effective or less purpose at work. Like sometimes I feel that I'm like, we have this huge pandemic going on, and it's hard to find that kind of meaningful connection or like whatever you're doing in your job. Like I'm making an impact here. And with the pandemic, I think it added a little bit of weight to it's like this extra straw, this extra really big box of crap that's sitting on top of everything. Was that the same for you?
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's not just the pandemic, right? But whenever there's something big happening in the world, you do feel like whatever you're doing is it's not as important, right? Like when you're like busy with work on your normal day, like this is the most one of the most important things to you, right? Like you're trying to make a difference, you're trying to do the best that you can do. You put all of your effort into it. But then when you turn on the news and like everything's, going to crap, and then you think like, wow, like I'm doing nothing. Like
Mhm.
I have no influence over this situation. There's so many terrible things in the world, and things that you have no influence over. And in terms of scale, like your work compared to that, it's not as important. It doesn't really do anything. I perfectly know what you mean. To be completely honest, I don't have a way of dealing with this.
Mm,
Generally, when I get that feeling, I just try to distract myself. Like I don't think about either of work or the world events. I try to like I don't know, read a book, play games,
mhm.
but I just try to escape basically. So I know what you mean, but I personally I haven't been able to beat that.
Well, I think that to, it's not get too psychological, but the myth of, like you said, trying to beat it, right? Like when we started quarantining the pandemic, we thought what? Like when Fauci, at least in America, when Dr. Fauci said, "Oh, we're going to be looking at 2022 before we get out of this." This was in 2019, and I'm looking at that. And I'm like, no way, like no way is it going to last that long. And you forget that like the pandemic is prolonged. We all started off like people describe, like in some of the articles I've been researching, feeling very positive, right? Of like, okay, like I can find purpose in my work for a time, but then it's like 3 months bleeds into six, six bleeds into nine, and then you blink and we're a year and a half in. And as what was I reading to you beforehand about the level of anger that has increased in professions of like it went from like 12% in 2020 to or in 2019 to 36% in 2021 in academic professions. That I mean, I felt that. That's just not with academic profession. I feel like if things prolong like this, it's inevitable to start to feel a certain way about life. And to your point, like you're saying, like, I don't know how to beat this. And I would say, like, from psychological research, what you're doing is adaptive. I mean, when we get overloaded, you don't you don't actually want to process and deal with a chronic trigger, right? Because it's not stopping, right? We only deal with situations and process them and heal from them when there's a stopped endpoint of something.
Yeah,
You
when
know,
they're over, right?
right? And a common example of this is when I'm dealing with a 14-year-old who yeah, there's an ongoing child protective services in which the kids are currently being abused and they're trying to get out of that situation. It's actually not the best thing in therapy to want to bring that up and try to process it and heal from it as it's ongoing. It's kind of like Pandora's box, right? The second you open it, it's like it's really hard to get it closed. And what we find is if you do that, people start to feel moodier and more irritable as you have a session, and then the next week they're more anxious and they actually have a harder time dealing with their life versus their current way of managing is an adaptive thing. I think that when you get them out of the situation, and in this case, when COVID quote unquote ends,
Whatever
you
that
had a lot
is.
of
Yeah.
people reflecting, but it doesn't end, right? We're depending on where you look in the United States, and I don't know about Europe, but depending on where you look in the United States, rates are either increasing or decreasing. People are still grieving over loved ones. People are still in the hospital, and how do you stay
How do you?
sane?
That
you know,
that's a very good question. Yeah, Europe is more or less the same.
Mm.
The numbers are down generally, as far as I know, and this is April 2022. So numbers are down, and a lot of restrictions are lifted, but the anxiety isn't gone. I think people still, even when they don't have to, like people still worry about the masks, the vaccines, testing, because you never know. Like it's not over for sure, right? You still see the numbers of people being in the hospital, people, loved ones dying. So while the government tells you that it's almost gone, you know that it's really not. So the anxiety is still there, and you still cannot really process it fully because it's still a part of our lives
Yeah, it's this ever kind of like changing beast that we deal with, right?
at this point. Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask you what has helped in all this? Like, you had some questions beforehand about like, what would be mental health recommendations, but before I get to that, can I ask you what has helped you through burnout and pandemic fatigue to cope?
Yeah, sure. To be
You're
honest,
like
across the years,
you're like
uh,
smiling and say nothing.
no,
Nothing at all.
that would probably be a great answer, but no, no. Some things do help, but it honestly depends on the situation. Um, I think what's really important is what we just mentioned. If the situation is still ongoing, if something that caused your burnout is still a thing, it might be hard to like move past that to refresh
Mhm.
yourself. I think the number one thing, and if that's difficult, but the number one thing is just to take time off.
Mhm.
If a person is able to, and if I'm able to, I just take a week off, or I take a long weekend, and during that time, I try to distract myself. I try to think of something else, focus on something else, play video games, read books. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Podcasts are amazing.
Yeah.
I take long walks in the park with my favorite podcast, and it helps me to think and to get engrossed, in something else, to dive into a different world, not necessarily video games, not necessarily my work or my personal life, but just something completely different, a different story from a
Mhm.
different place that really helps my mind to get off things and to feel better. If I'm unable to take time off, there are micro things like your favorite music. Just turn off the lights, turn off your computer, shut down your phone, like light a nice aroma candle, listen to your favorite music for like 30 minutes to an hour
Yeah.
before going to bed. Like it feels better. You feel better. And you try to go to bed with a clear mind. Don't think about work, and try to hopefully wake up a more fresher person, a person that's able to tackle the challenges. But just
Yeah.
trying to have a peaceful night, basically trying to relax. And there are obvious things too that I think are just universally useful, like trying to eat more healthy, trying to exercise. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not gonna say that I'm a perfect healthy foodie, or like I exercise every single day. No, I'm terrible with those things, but at least I try to keep up with some of it, and it helps. One small thing like adds up. It helps. It helps to try to stay healthy, and that's probably the only things that worked for me. I was never looking for therapy, to be honest. I was considering it at times, for sure.
The
I
irony that you're
never
talking to us right now. And you
exactly.
do.
I think I've never reached that point. I
Mhm.
didn't I never jumped the gun to actually start therapy. I was considering it, and I think there's no shame in that. I think if a person feels like, hey, I don't know what to do, I need some help, I need to talk to someone, I think go ahead, talk to someone. I think that's really important, and I think that's totally okay. I was lucky, I guess, at least for now, that
Yeah.
I had, let's say, resources available to me. I had
Yeah.
friends, like an understanding girlfriend, colleagues, like video games, hobbies, and other activities to help me get distracted. If someone's in a situation where they can do that, I think probably my advice would be to talk to someone who can help you understand that.
Yeah. You bring up a lot of good points. I Burnout is one of those things that it's incredibly I think it is one of the hardest things to alleviate, right? Like, the focus is on the job of, when we define burnout, it's job related, chronic, it's a syndrome related to chronic stress of the job. But really, it's not like that just disappears when the job isn't there, right? A lot of people are left with that kind of lack of motivation for everything. We talk about how much those symptoms weighed into symptoms of depression. Um, Setting boundaries, you know, the things you've outlined of like exercise, eating right, having scheduled time for yourself, self care, you got to be just as diligent about your care to yourself as you are with the way you work, right? Like it's got to be just as rigorous. And even though it's difficult, you're trying to set aside time for yourself to recover. You talk about taking long weekends, social support, medication, therapy, all of those things help, but it has to be this kind of like chronic thing, right? You got to be doing it religiously to the point that you're taking time for that side of yourself too to recover. They talk in the literature, they talk about talking to your supervisor, explaining to things if it's an unhealthy work environment. But I don't know if I have no data on this, but some of the stuff that we're talking about with burnout recently is not necessarily just job, right? Like I think that yes, if we're talking about healthcare professions, if we're talking about academia, there's plenty of research that is directly related to that profession itself causing additional symptoms of burnout, right? But when we're in more broader strokes of like, even in situations where like you say, like a Ubisoft, where your management is good, they're recommending you take time off, symptoms of burnout can still arise, not because you feel like that it's due to an unhealthy work environment, but like COVID feels like Groundhog Day. Like I do the same thing every day, especially when you've been quarantined for, like, let's say you quarantine for 2 weeks or whatever, or a month, or, in my case, for example, like I start working and then there's a COVID outbreak at my son's daycare. Now the daycare has to close. Now I got to stop working. Right? It's not like I hate either of those things or I've lost efficiency in the job. It's just the stress of what COVID has caused. It's like
It's
you have
the
to
extra factor that you cannot control.
yes,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
You bring up a good point. I think when you could be, you could be like, let's say, stressed, very focused or engaged in your work, but you can still be okay, right? You can manage things. Things could be going fine. But then something happens that's outside of your work. It could be a thing in your personal life, family life, a world
Mhm.
event, or even something as dumb as like your car breaking down. Like, and that's just an extra thing that you have to deal with, and you might not have the mental capacity to deal with it at that point in time. And that's what, like, gets you over the edge.
Oh yeah, that's what tips the scales. Like it is. It is never the big thing. I don't know if you're the case, if that's the case for you, but for me, it's always the quote unquote smaller things, like the extra thing that comes up that I didn't expect. That's really tiny. That really is only going to take me 30 minutes, but the fact that I have to stop what I'm doing and do it is the energy that is, I guess, goes into that void. Burnout is a void. It's like a cynical dark void, and once you fall down, it's really hard to crawl back up out of the
It's like
hole.
a well that you fall into. Yeah,
Yeah.
for me, it's the same. It's the small things that add up. It's the extra things that I don't have the energy to deal with. And then it's to make a video game analogy, it's like you have a health bar, right? Like, or an
Right.
energy bar or a mana, and
I love
you
mana
do your
rings.
yeah, you do your job, you do all of your tasks, personal life, work life, whatever. You spend your mana points, but then, when you think like, okay, I'm good, I've used up all my mana, but I did everything, and then there's an extra thing. But wait,
Yeah.
you're out of mana. You don't have the resource to deal with that situation, and that's when you kind of, your mentality breaks down.
Yeah. I immediately thought of Dark Souls.
Same. When I was doing the mana thing, same. Dark Souls.
Oh yeah, Dark Souls, like Dark Souls 3, the Abyss Watchers, when it goes to the second stage, and you're like, how am I? Because I think that's the first one that they go to the second stage with fire, because you expend all your stuff trying to fight the first stage, and you think you've killed the thing, and then it's like, oh, here's the second stage, and I feel like that's burnout. Like there's like, okay, I've done everything, I've gotten everything nailed down, and then boom, here's this other thing. Now I've got to, how do I manage this, right? You know,
Yeah,
and that could
yeah. And
be anything,
sometimes
like you said.
you don't have the answer to that normally. Yeah.
Right. I want to go through some of this really quickly on just statistics about burnout and talking about some ways to manage things. So, as we said earlier, like it's a three-dimensional model, right? Prolonged response to chronic stress, overwhelming exhaustion, feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job, and then the sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. Uh, to they talk about the exhaustion dimension is wearing out, loss of energy, a depletion, fatigue, and then cynicism was originally conceptualized as depersonalization, so feeling disconnected. So if I'm, for example, if I'm 90% of the time really connected to my patients, and then I come in 1 week and I'm like, this is, well, why am I doing this? Right? I don't feel like I'm helping them. That's an example of depersonalization. I've lost the meaning with which I'm connecting myself to my job. Um, Inefficiency is a pretty self-explanatory. You feel a lack of personal accomplishment. Um, you know, there's more changes in the burnout models now. Um, they talk about job stressors and an imbalance of work demands versus individual resources. Resources are social support, time off, support from your boss or supervisor, individual strain. They talk about like underlying concepts of anxiety and depression and how that and how well equipped we are to manage our job strain. But I think that I want to hit home like on a very concrete level how I was looking up. It's not just emotional, but there's also brain structure changes that people have enlarged amygdala and they have more thinning of the prefrontal cortex with prolonged burnout. Like this stuff is it literally changes our brain structure. Similarly, not ironically, but similarly, trauma does the same thing to our amygdala. When we experience trauma, we have enlarged amygdala. And one of
So
the things that is, what's that?
my question is that change permanent? Like, what happens to our brains when that happens?
Yeah, good question. So, one of the things we know from research, and this is like a classic book in therapy, and just in psychological trauma research, "The Body Keeps Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. He's kind of started a whole movement about yoga and deep breathing as reducing somatic symptoms of trauma. And what we know is if you're doing deep breathing and yoga, you can actually decrease the size of the amygdala. Meditation also does that, so you can repair what you thought was lost. So that, to answer your question, they're not permanent with therapy, medication. It doesn't have to be yoga, but it has to be a change in framework of how you view your life. So yoga is the vehicle for that, for example, but when we're talking about that could be progressive muscle relaxation, that could be running 2 miles a day, but the idea of getting your body reducing its reactionary responses, emotional responses, particularly negative emotional responses, that fight or flight, if we can reduce that, then like if it's kind of like a transitive property of like, okay, I've done yoga, now my amygdala are smaller. Now when I experience a stressful situation, I'm actually not responding as heightened as I used to. And therefore it makes me manage that situation better. So it's kind of like this cumulative thing that we do. And so that's why it's
Okay,
really important. Yeah, go ahead.
that gives me some hope. That's actually that's good news. Okay, there are ways to deal with this. That's great.
Well, and I think that remembering it is transient of like sometimes burnout lasts a long time, but there is ways to, like, I'm glad that gave you hope. Like there is ways to manage it. There is ways to, as you say, combat it and change. Um, I'm just trying to look at some other stuff here. Like, it
Okay, let me
focuses.
ask you something else. So,
Yeah.
in general, let's say
Yeah.
if a person experiences burnout, or not necessarily burnout, but some of the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And they're unsure what to do. So, you think it would be a good course of action to ask for outside help, right? Like to go to a therapist, for example. Is that
I
like
would,
a request that you normally get? Like, do you have patients that come to you with that?
yes. And anecdotally, I can tell you, and then from research, some of the article that was published in Nature, I can tell you that job related burnout in amidst pandemic has been one of my and one of our most frequent kind of presenting problems. Um, I just in reading here, the Nature article says in a poll of 1,122 U.S. faculty members, almost 70% of the respondents said they felt stressed in 2020, more than double the number in 2019. In 2020, 35% felt angrier, whereas 12% said that in 2019. More than half the people surveyed said they were seriously considering changing their career or retiring early. Um, this is not, like I said, it's not just academics, but I can just tell you that the way, and this may be a topic for another time, but the way businesses have responded, particularly the companies that I may not name here where I'm stationed in Arizona, but I just know that the way companies have responded has been to, oh, you're working from home? We're going to give you more work and basically run you into the ground. And we're going to frame it as, oh, we're not making a profit, which really is inaccurate. It's a lot of companies have actually done very well in the pandemic, and the workers have gotten more disenfranchised. And that,
And there was something, I've read an article about it, something called the Great. What was the name? The Great Resigning, something like that. And workers
yeah,
basically became, they lost their connection to their employer. They understood that they're exploited more, and
mm-hmm.
they, instead of taking it on the chin, they were just like, no, I'm gone, I'm leaving. I think
Yeah,
it's a big thing worldwide. It's been happening here in France as well. Like
yeah,
workers are, I think that disconnect from the corporate culture when you're coming into the office, into the building every single day, it gave people more freedom to understand, like, okay, like, is that something that I want to do? Is that something that I still believe in, like in spending my life on?
mm-hmm.
I mean, anecdotally, I know quite a few people just across the world among my friends that are like, that were questioning their career choices, their employment choices,
Yeah,
even specific roles of like, okay, well, after looking at the pandemic and after spending some time away from the physical office and spending time with family, maybe that's something that I want to do more. Like there are
yeah,
people discovering that as an option now.
yeah. Well, I wanted to spend this last few minutes discussing, reviewing some ways to help. And Philip, I think what you just talked about there. I think our listeners are really going to feel validated by hearing. But just to reiterate, there's no one answer for everyone on how to combat burnout. But starting with being disciplined about scheduling time for self care. Starting, social support is huge, right? Reaching out to your boss, your supervisor, your colleagues, and to discuss that. Sometimes it goes a long way. Um, just having a colleague that empathizes with you and goes, yeah, man, I'm feeling that too. Because sometimes I think with the pandemic, you just feel isolated and think it's only happening to you. But really,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is,
because you don't see it happening to other people. Yeah,
yeah, doing some yoga, doing any form of exercise. Uh, but I think overall, at least what I have found most helpful, and I'm going to get philosophical here for a bit, but um, Albert Camus, he's a French philosopher. He wrote this book called The Myth of Sisyphus, and if you know Sisyphus from Greek, he is the guy that was cursed to Hades to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. And Hades cast a spell in which when he pushed the boulder up the hill, it fell back down. And so what he was doing is every day for the rest of his life, he's pushing a boulder up a hill. And Albert Camus, the philosopher, wanted to answer the question of the philosophical meaning of suicide. Is life worth living? At some point, we get to a point in our lives where we realize that we're doing the same thing every day. That there's kind of this, he calls this the absurd of like, I feel like I have this hope for my life. And at some point, whether or not I'm 30 or it's going to be the next thing I get to, but realize I wake up and I'm like, I work for a few hours, take a break, go back to work, I go home, and that's my life. And he says that's where the connectedness of like who I am and what I want to do is disconnected from the reality of life itself, which is it has in his framework, it has no meaning. And so he says, how do you find meaning? And he gives the example of Sisyphus, and he says, you should picture Sisyphus smiling as he pushes the boulder up the hill. In the sense of, don't worry about the future or what you're doing, but the task itself, life itself. So even if it's doing the dishes, which is an example of pushing the boulder up the hill, right? Finding some present moment in that and trying to be mindful about what you're doing, because you would never picture Sisyphus smiling pushing the boulder up the hill, and you would never picture yourself smiling doing the dishes. But if you can try to be present and recognize that the people around you, either with your family or friends, even in those little things, those are some things that count of like, this is life, and today is going to be whatever I'm doing today. And I'm going to try to take care of myself today, set some boundaries, not turn on the news, hang out with friends and play video games, and try to be in that mindset totally. Because, like you said, Philip, that other stuff you can't control. You can only control the impact that you're doing, day to day.
That's great advice. Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
and I recommend.
Very
I recommend.
philosophical, but it's great. Any
I
other
use
like? Is there any
what's
other
that?
books or articles that you recommend to read,
Oh
like in
yeah,
general, to listeners?
oh yeah. Viktor Frankl's *The Man's Search for Meaning* is a classic therapy, but also just life book to read. He's a Nazi camp survivor, and he doesn't go into the gruesome details of what happened per se, but more of how do you find meaning out of such horrible situations, and how do you move on with your life or find purpose in your life when you're aware of not just what happened to you, but the lack of control and difficulties in the world. Um, if you're looking for more kind of concrete stuff, I would, I'd recommend like Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Um, Psychology books, but really, burnout is something. I mean, you can find all the stuff we discussed, and you can, if you Google those things, like all that stuff, it's really about, like getting into therapy or increasing your social support, talking to people, setting boundaries, scheduling time for yourself as diligent as you've applied to your work. Because I think a lot of us, I'd like to think a lot of us work very hard, and we got to be just as diligent about our personal lives as we are about our professional lives. We care about our work.
Yeah,
We should care about ourselves too. Self compassion. If people are looking up, like Kristen Neff she's the guru on self compassion. She started self compassion research, so I'd encourage people to look her up as well. Um, yeah, it's been
great.
lovely having you
Thanks.
on.
Yeah, it was awesome to talk about this. It's been enlightening and it's been nice to share my experience as well.
Enlightening now, and I feel a little humbled. Like, oh, I don't know about enlightening.
it's
I think you've enlightened
it's
people. You've
I
enlightened me.
think we can have these concepts in our minds that we know what things are, or we can Google an article. But at the end of the day, it's not the same as talking to like a medical professional who deals with this every single day, right? Like you, who actually like it's your work, right? Same as for us, it's work to like build cars, games, or office chairs. For you, it's helping people deal with this stuff. So I think it's important to talk to someone who knows what it is for a profession.
Yeah, and just to have, the way I compare therapy is like a physician checkup. Everyone should have access to therapy, and it should be like a once a month, type thing where I go in to see my quote unquote doctor, and I talk about things. And this topic for another time, but every therapist is different and every protocol is different, but it's usually not like Freud anymore, where you're laying on a couch and just spewing your thoughts. It's work. You work on yourself and you prioritize yourself. And I think that's one of the things that's so critical in combating burnout is prioritizing the self.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. You're important too. So make sure you work on yourself. That's a good way to go about life.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely talking to you, Philip, and I hope to have you on again.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure. Take care.